had no capacity to be with the emotions of other people. I was completely incapable to acknowledge, let alone meet, the reality of the experience. I went into this kind of a freeze mode and I became a bit like an emotionless zombie. I was no longer able to relate to people on an emotional level. I was basically living from here to there, you know, and completely disconnected from what was from the heart, let alone the God. Hi, everyone, and welcome to new subscribers. Thanks so much for joining me in my explorations, my rumblings, and my conversations with different guests on this channel. I always like to mention at the very beginning that the best way and the easiest way to support the channel is to simply like the video. Of course, that's if you enjoyed it. And also to comment and share what resonated with you and why. I also would like to say, especially to anyone who's new to this channel, that this is really a space for everyone, that welcomes everyone regardless of where they are at in this awakening process, where they're at in this journey. And so for some, where they're at can be quite challenging, because at certain point this process can get, well, tough to say the least. It can be very disorienting, it can be very destabilizing, and often even frightening. And so I'd like to ask anyone who comments to bear that in mind and to be respectful of that and to simply be kind. Thanks so much. So today's exploration has to do with compassion. It's one of the topics that comes up quite a bit in the emails and in my conversations. There can be quite a bit of confusion around this topic. You know, there are people who do share with me their concerns, especially when it comes to the farther stages of realization, and they're worried that they're just, they're going to either lose compassion or that they just won't be able to sort of relate with people on an emotional level. And so, believe me, I completely understand those concerns. And so I just wanted to say that I acknowledge that, which is why I wanted to talk about it. Because if you watched especially the two previous videos, but specifically the one about suffering, whether awakening and suffering, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, that anything that we're exploring here is really contextual. Everything depends on really where we're at in the process. And so whether it's suffering or compassion or any other topic, how we perceive it, how we experience it is going to change depending on where we're at in this journey. And so I'd like to explore this by giving you some examples from my own journey and how even this compassion has been on a kind of a journey of its own, to be honest, throughout this process. So just for context, and just so you can see how this whole thing has been evolving, when I was growing up, I was a very compassionate, very empathetic, very sensitive kid. And I was always moved by people's suffering and willing to help whenever I could, sometimes to my detriment, I have to say, but that's like a completely different story. Now, fast forward to my first awakening, and if you watch the previous videos, then you heard me talk about it many times. But just to give a gist, just to kind of give a recap, the reason why it was such a powerful experience was because I got an insight into the nature of thought, which was so profound because, first of all, I had no idea how much thinking was going on in the background all the time, even when I wasn't aware of it, and how it was creating my experience of reality and how it shaped the way I perceive myself, the world, and other people. And so, and above all, it allowed me to see how the narratives and the commentary have been creating so much suffering. And that insight really just changed everything, changed in a split second the way I saw my life, the way I saw myself and people in my life, including all the challenges and problems. And so the other reason why this insight was so important is because I think it was the first time that I recognized what I could maybe refer to as like our inherent wholeness. So I no longer thought of myself as broken. I no longer thought of myself as someone who needs to improve, someone who needs to be fixed in order to be whole. The other reason why this was such a powerful insight is because I no longer saw myself as a victim. I could see how no matter what anyone says or does was one thing. So it's not that there was any denial about that, but how much my own thinking, my own narratives, my own beliefs about what's been said or done was creating the suffering. And so this ended this kind of sense of victimhood that was there before that insight. So initially, all I felt as a result of this insight was just pure joy. And it was a very kind of, it was almost like kind of, almost like born again kind of a feeling. And it had real innocence to it. You know, it was very childlike, kind of intense and annoying for people around me at the time. Then after this really long 3 year sort of post awakening honeymoon period, I plunged back into suffering. And it was very gradual process. And I can tell you that everything I can tell you about it, everything that I'm going to say, I had absolutely no clue that this was going on. I can only talk about it and see in retrospect. And I actually find it quite fascinating because the way I see it anyway, awakening is a bit like a colonic, you know, it sort of brings things up to the surface, things that been suppressed, things that are difficult, things that are challenging to look at, right? And that will happen differently at different stages. And this may happen shortly after the first insight, first awakening, but it can happen even years later. Again, it depends because our journeys, despite similarities, are unique. And so this is what was happening at the time. There was so much that was repressed that was coming up to the surface, and I could feel those really, you know, powerful emotions trying to come up and simply be felt, whether this was grief or anger or fear, and this was simply not allowed. And I would dismiss everything as just a story, everything as just a thought, even when I didn't even know what the thought actually was. I would just assume that I must have thought some kind of thought, and that thought was creating the fear, and that thought was creating my anger, suffering, or whatever. At that point, the mind basically hijacked this first insight, this first insight into the nature of thought and turn it into a hiding place. It turned it into almost like a coping mechanism. So in one of the recent videos, I talked about how it's just a thought or it's just an illusion, and you can replace this word with whatever word you can resonate with more. You know, became like my mantra. It was like a shield. I would do anything to basically not think and not feel whatever was going on. But of course, I didn't know that this was the case. And so this is where, you know, I was really suffering because of that, because of this constant pushing back, pushing against, trying to numb, trying to distract from any emotional discomfort. But at the same time, I was completely disassociated from it. So, quite honestly, if you had asked me at the time if I was okay, if I was suffering, if I was experiencing any of this, I would have said no. And so there was almost like a kind of a split where if you had asked me if I was okay, I was responding from this knowing that I was fundamentally okay, no matter what was happening in my experience. Which is why I would have said, I'm fine, I'm okay, right? I was responding, so to speak, from this deeper reality that I got an insight to, from this place that I knew where I was fundamentally okay, from that place that knew that everything is okay, regardless of what the experience looks or feels like on the surface. But while I was able to sort of tap into and respond from that deeper reality, I was completely incapable to acknowledge, let alone meet the reality of the experience of my current experience in any moment. I had zero ability to simply acknowledge that, let's say I was anxious, to acknowledge that I was feeling angry, to acknowledge that I was struggling with anything. Not only that, there was this thought that I should not have been feeling this way because of that insight. So there was this constant split between sort of living and knowing the deeper reality, but also having simultaneously the kind of reality that was going on and not being at odds with it all the time, you know? There came a point where basically any disturbing thoughts that I was thinking, even though I knew it was just a thought, any disturbing emotions, I found them threatening. I simply found them threatening. It's almost like I went into this kind of a freeze mode and I became a bit like an emotionless zombie, just walking around, sort of feeling things sort of very on the surface and sometimes not at all. And it was a really, really suffocating experience. It was like, yeah, like I just didn't feel alive. I was alive. I may have been alive when things were going well, and I might have felt alive when I kind of tapped back into, the deeper reality and the fundamental okayness and all of that. But boy, whenever anything started coming up that was disrupting this piece, that was disrupting my nervous system, that I could feel the contractions, that I could feel the waves of terror, that was just completely terrifying. And so, as a result of that, because I was unable to because I had zero tolerance for my disturbing thoughts, my painful thoughts, painful memories, and for any painful emotions, challenging emotions, I had no capacity to be with the emotions of other people. So I I was no longer able to relate to people on an emotional level at all. And it really affected my relationships because every time someone would start to like complain about something and they simply want anytime someone simply wanted to tell me what's going on for them, to complain about something or to vent, and there was some kind of like emotional unraveling going on, I could literally feel this sort of like a inner wall sort of come up as like a protective mechanism. And all I could see was someone who was completely lost in their narratives and who was just kind of stuck in their sense of victimhood. And I was not going to support that. To acknowledge what was shared, to express any kind of support, meant that I was feeding those narratives and I was feeding that sense of victimhood. So I had no idea, at the time that it was possible to recognize that someone is lost in narratives and still acknowledge their experience and still show compassion and be able to support them. But at the time, it was simply not possible. Not only that, whenever I had someone share their experience and maybe vent or complain about something and get emotional, and if I witnessed someone else showing empathy, showing some compassion toward that person, and I was witnessing that, it would drive me nuts. It actually triggered a lot of anger in me, because now I was seeing how this person was just feeding that victim story, and that person was just feeding the narratives. I would have been the one who was like beyond it, I was beyond it, but I was really suffering. But I also remember moments of like little moments when I saw someone just being vulnerable and expressing themselves fully and expressing that vulnerability. And there was part of me that like was envious because I was suffocating. I was I was basically living from here to there, you know, and completely disconnected from what was from the heart, let alone the God. I also had this kind of arrogance that came from like seeing something that other people didn't see, seeing the fact that they are lost in their thoughts, seeing the fact that they're lost in their victimhood. And I kind of feel like I was above it in one sense, even though I was suffering, right, at the same time. And so, you know, I I did not want to hear anything about trauma, about childhood wounds, because once again, all this stuff to me was just a narrative. It's just another story that the mind just wants to lose itself in, and so on. And it's not that there isn't truth to it, but I had absolutely no idea that the beliefs and imprints are not just that the thoughts, beliefs, and imprints are not just perceptual, not just cognitive, which is why now I know that to know that something is just a thought or belief is not enough, because those because beliefs and live very much in the body, and the awakening the awakening process wants to illuminate them. It wants to bring them up to the surface. It wants that whatever that belief carries is fully felt, and only then that belief truly dissolves. Because of all those things, I was not able to relate to people on an emotional level. I was not able to support them in a way that actually was very natural to me as I was growing up. Like the things that would just come up naturally, like holding someone's hand and, just listening to whatever they want to say, even without having to say anything back or having to sort anything out or anything, gone, gone. So even though I wasn't spiritual, I never considered myself spiritual, and or had nothing, like I didn't explore non-duality or anything like that at the time. If I met myself then, I would definitely refer to myself as a spiritual jerk. you know, because that's how I was acting, you know. I was acting like a jerk often. I can only see now that I just wasn't aware. I wasn't aware of anything I've shared with you so far. You know, I wasn't aware that I was suppressing. I wasn't aware. I wasn't aware that I was constantly waging war with my experience. You know, so much of that being such a jerk and not being able to relate emotionally actually was connected to so much fear of being affected by my own emotional responses and experiences, let alone everybody else's. When I come across this very same attitude, I recognize it immediately as something that I've done, that I've been there, I've done that, I said those things, I spoke with zero consideration, with zero compassion, with all of that. And when I recognize that, then I also tend to remember that in those very moments, and I'm not using it as an excuse or as a way to say, and therefore it's okay to tolerate those kinds of behaviors or that kind of attitude. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying that, you know, I can't help but see that there's a lot of pain there as well, you know? And so, but sometimes I forget. And when I forget, then I just, you know, it just irritates me big time. So fast forward, clearly there came a point where my body just said no. You know, my body just went, enough is enough. I can't sustain this wall, this war with disturbing thoughts and disturbing painful emotions anymore. And that's when the emotional breakdown happened, which, if you've been listening to previous videos, I talked about it in more detail. That plunged me to a massive dark night where my self-concept was basically demolished bit by bit, where all kinds of beliefs that I carried about myself were just being exposed and kind of seen as a lie. And all the lovely things that I thought about myself, all the things that I thought I wasn't, but judged others for, you know, I was finding all of it in me. And this is one of the reasons why I keep on saying that I cannot imagine this awakening process without this bit in the journey, as excruciating, as painful as it was, but only to the so-called ego. To the so-called ego, you know, it was yeah, it was really, really excruciating process. The reason why I'm saying it was such a pivotal part of the journey was because the unconscious stuff was now finally allowed to become conscious. All of the sudden, I was seeing the unconscious beliefs. I was seeing the certain patterns of behavior, all sorts of protective mechanisms that were playing out throughout my life, especially in the context of relationships. But what I also got to see is basically the innocence of the human condition. And that conditioning is simply what's been learned. That was as a result of being exposed to particular parents, particular environment, particular culture, particular you know, educational system, particular religion, whatever. And I saw the innocence of how this is being constructed and all the, and I saw the inherent innocence, not just in myself, but in all humans. For as long as we don't see and recognize it as a conditioning, that we don't question, we don't inquire into those beliefs, that when, for as long as we're not openly willing to look at ourselves and honestly meet ourselves with all the so-called good and all the so-called bad, all the nice things about us and all the abhorrent things about us, because they're there, but for many of us to even acknowledge that that might be a possibility, that there's this whole other side when it comes to our conditioned self and our behaviors and our attitudes. For some people to even acknowledge that that might be a possibility of finding something that's just not going to be so easy to see, that's too much. And I get that. And I have absolutely no judgment around that, because there's really nothing fun or joyful or blissful about finding the narcissist in you, finding out about your manipulative behaviors, about some deceitful behaviors, about lies, about whatever, fill the blanks with all the things that we generally find abhorrent or awful, or whatever. So this is why we often hear people that this journey is not for the faint of heart, or who just want to like float on a transcendental, filled with bliss kind of a cloud. That's why you can hear people often say that. This part of the process is totally blissless, without having gone through that process and seeing that inherent innocence of the conditioning that we operate from, and how much of it, especially how much of it, is so utterly unconscious. There was I couldn't help but recognize it in everyone else. And I thought I kind of knew that. Like on the surface, I was kind of aware of that. But it's only when I started seeing into the depths of my own unconscious conditioning that I was operating from, especially in the relationships, that I could then recognize it, that same conditioning, that same inherent innocence in everyone else. And that was both humiliating and incredibly humbling. And that's when the compassion started to reemerge for the first time as a result of this excruciating and the kind of process that really brought me down to my knees. But that process hasn't stopped there. What followed from this was this awakening at the level of the heart, the complete dissolution of any sense of separation, and seeing that unconditional love at the core of our being. And in that space, nothing was excluded. The very things that I've always wanted to push away, the things that I feared to look at most, the ones that I had most shame around or guilt, all of it was welcome to be seen, and to really look at it properly with curiosity, but without the judgment. And that's when what I call compassion with capital C just emerged out of that experience. That was actually so powerful. It was actually overwhelming for quite some time, because I just couldn't look at anyone and not see God. I just couldn't. Which, of course, when we think of the people we despise the most, the last thing we see in those people is God, right? Which is why this is such a challenging part of this journey, because it's through this experience that I had not only seen the depths of the unconscious that drives the behaviors and the inherent innocence of it, but also what I saw is how much of what happens, of the behaviors that we condone and judge, comes out of pain caused by the sense of separation, and how that sense of separation creates so much fear, and how out of that fear so many behaviors that serve as protective mechanisms emerge. And it really doesn't mean, and I can't underline it more, that this has absolutely nothing to do with that, you know, this unconditional love doesn't, this compassion doesn't mean that we just let people get away with anything, you know, that there is no boundaries, that we just tolerate somebody's behavior, right? That has nothing to do with that. What was possible for the first time is to recognize the behavior, to not be okay with the behavior, while that compassion has never left, that recognition of the fundamental inherent innocence remained. At the start, after the opening of the heart, that compassion was, you know, completely overwhelming, completely overwhelming. And at the same time, it was such a relief, especially for this body and nervous system that was living like this closed fist for such a long time, to finally experience what I refer to as emotional freedom, basically. You know, when finally whatever was coming up to the surface was finally allowed to be felt. So I went from not being able to relate on an emotional level to being able to be with somebody's pain and suffering in such a way that, like, I've never knew even before the first awakening. It was just this open space that felt so inherently safe that it translated into simply more capacity also in the body to be with someone's pain without fearing now that that pain it was going to affect me. I remember seeing clients for the birth chart where I could, you know, see what they've been through and see the suffering that they experience, especially growing up, but also in current situation. And there was just so much emotion. There was so much, you know, it's almost as though there was only one pain. It wasn't like their pain, my pain. There was just like shared pain, and such a profound understanding of where they're at and where that suffering was coming from. So compassion was not only restored, but it was really on steroids. And I have never felt that kind of intimacy with even strangers sharing their experiences that I was able to experience, you know, at the time. So it was very, very powerful. The kind of intensity that I felt initially would start to subside, and it settled, but it stayed. And it was there even when I went through the next shift, when I experienced the nothingness, when I experienced the end of this idea of me and my life, the being no doer. It stayed. The compassion stayed. And it's here today. But the compassion that remained, it's there. But it's very difficult for me to actually articulate what that compassion feels like, because it's not like a thing. It's not something that comes with rules and regulations, you know. It's not a compassion that has to look a certain way. There's nothing fixed about this compassion. There's simply, I suppose that it's mostly to do with just the profound recognition of the innocence, inherent innocence of the human condition. It's because of the profound recognition of the pain that's caused by the sense of separation and the fear that remained. But how that compassion actually manifests in like day to day is going to be different, because that compassion is not like performative, it's not that it has to be expressed a certain way. There's nothing fixed about it. Sometimes this compassion looks like, a warm hug. Sometimes it's the holding of someone's hand. Sometimes it is the sadness and grief that I and the other person kind of share as they are sharing their story or telling me about their situation. But sometimes that compassion is a firm no. It's a firm boundary. Sometimes the compassion can even be angry. It's really not about what that looks like specifically on the surface, which is why at this point it's kind of difficult for me to even talk about it as though it was a kind of a thing. But it's that, it's that. And so I hope that by sharing few bits and pieces of my story and some examples, I was able to demonstrate that even compassion in the context of the awakening process has been evolving, has gone through stages where there was no compassion whatsoever. Then the compassion was restored, then it was experienced a certain way, and then that changed again. And so as you can see, there's nothing fixed ever about this process, which is, one of my favorite things to talk about. So I don't know how much of what I shared resonated with you, but if something did resonate, then let me know in the comments, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.